Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what happened in Riyadh in the last 72 hours is not a diplomatic dispute. It is not a negotiating tactic. It is not posturing ahead of a trade summit. What happened in Riyadh is the quiet, deliberate execution of a decision that has been building for 18 months, and the consequences of that decision will arrive at your doorstep whether you are paying attention or not. I am looking at a Treasury notification that has been circulating among senior currency analysts and Gulf financial advisors since Tuesday morning. What it describes is not a tariff adjustment. It is not a currency peg modification. It is not a sovereign wealth fund rebalancing. What it describes is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia formally instructing its sovereign wealth custodians to freeze the liquidation of approximately $14 billion in U.S. denominated financial instruments, Treasury bonds, dollar indexed holdings, and structured dollar assets, pending a comprehensive review of the Kingdom's reserve currency exposure. $14 billion. Frozen. Not withdrawn. Not sold. Frozen. And that distinction is exactly where this story begins. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why this freeze matters more than any headline you have read this week. Why the institutional architecture of the global dollar system is far more fragile than Washington has been willing to admit, and why what Saudi Arabia just did is not an isolated act of financial diplomacy, but the most consequential signal of monetary realignment in 50 years. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being analyzed right now by currency desks at JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and the Bank for International Settlements. You will not be hearing this framing from mainstream financial media tonight. Let us start with the foundation, because the petrodollar system is genuinely misunderstood by most people who use that term. And that misunderstanding is precisely why today's news is being underreported. In 1974, following the first OPEC oil embargo, the United States and Saudi Arabia reached a bilateral agreement that would define the architecture of global finance for the next 5 decades. The terms were straightforward. Saudi Arabia would denominate all of its oil exports exclusively in US dollars. In exchange, Washington would provide the kingdom with security guarantees, military hardware, and diplomatic protection. The consequence of that agreement was structural and profound. Every nation on Earth that needed oil, which was every nation on Earth, needed dollars to buy it. That need for dollars created permanent structural global demand for the U.S. currency, which in turn allowed Washington to run persistent trade deficits, export inflation, and finance its own debt at interest rates far lower than any other nation could access. The petrodollar was not a currency arrangement. It was a geopolitical subsidy, and it functioned for 50 years because Saudi Arabia had no better option. That calculation has now changed, and the freeze of $14 billion is the formal notification that it has changed. Subscribe now if you are watching this and realizing that the financial media has been missing this story for months. What I am about to explain in the next section is the mechanism, the specific institutional pathway, through which this freeze translates into something far larger than $14 billion. Announcement number 1, the freeze is not a withdrawal, it is a precedent, and the distinction carries systemic weight. When a sovereign wealth fund withdraws assets, it sells them. Those dollars re-enter the market, dollar liquidity is preserved, and the transaction, while meaningful, is contained within normal market function. But when assets are frozen, when a government formally instructs its custodians to halt the liquidation process pending a policy review, it signals something categorically different. It signals that the government is preparing to restructure not just the asset, but the framework within which the asset exists. Saudi Arabia is not selling dollars. It is questioning whether dollars should continue to be the foundational unit of its reserve architecture. That question, asked formally and publicly by the world's largest oil exporter, has never been asked before. Not in 1974. Not in 1979 during the Iranian Revolution. Not in 1990 during the Gulf War. Not in 2008 during the global financial crisis. It is being asked now in May 2026 because the conditions that made the petrodollar arrangement rational for Saudi Arabia have systematically eroded. According to reporting by the Financial Times and confirmed by 3 senior Gulf financial officials speaking to Reuters on condition of anonymity, the freeze follows a series of internal reviews conducted by the Saudi Public Investment Fund beginning in the 4th quarter of 2025. Those reviews were triggered by 2 specific developments. First, the imposition of U.S. secondary sanctions targeting Saudi financial institutions engaged in trade settlement with China. Second, Washington's use of dollar clearing infrastructure to block Iranian crude sales, a mechanism that Riyadh has watched with acute attention, knowing that the same infrastructure could be weaponized against Saudi transactions under a different political configuration. The PIF concluded, according to those officials, that dollar dependency represented a structural vulnerability that could no longer be managed through diplomatic relationship alone. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2. Saudi Arabia is not acting alone, and the coordinated nature of what is unfolding is what makes this categorically different from previous episodes of dollar skepticism. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the scale of what is happening becomes impossible to ignore. In the 12 months prior to this freeze, three parallel developments occurred that the mainstream financial press has been covering separately, failing to connect them into the unified strategic picture they represent. First, in September 2025, China and Saudi Arabia finalized the expansion of their yuan-denominated oil settlement framework, moving from a pilot program covering roughly 8% of bilateral trade to a formal arrangement now covering approximately 29% of all Saudi crude exports to China. China currently purchases 8 million barrels of Saudi oil per day. At 29% yuan settlement, that is more than 500,000 barrels daily, every day being priced, settled, and cleared outside the dollar system. Second, in January 2026, the Gulf Cooperation Council formally announced the acceleration of its regional currency settlement infrastructure, a cross-border payment system explicitly designed to allow member states to settle energy trades in local currencies without routing transactions through SWIFT or dollar-denominated clearinghouses. The International Monetary Fund flagged this development in its February 2026 Regional Economic Outlook as a potential source of dollar demand erosion. The flagging was polite. The implication was substantial. Third, and this is the piece almost no one in Western financial media is connecting correctly, the Saudi Central Bank, SAMA, quietly reduced its U.S. Treasury holdings by $11.4 billion between August and December 2025, according to U.S. Treasury Department data released in February. That reduction was characterized in the financial press as routine portfolio management. It was not routine. It was a calibrated reduction in dollar exposure occurring simultaneously with the expansion of yuan settlement and the development of GCC payment infrastructure. The freeze announced this week is not the beginning of this process. It is the public acknowledgement that the process is already well advanced. According to Bloomberg, the Saudi foreign minister met with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi in Riyadh on April 14, 2026, 4 days before the freeze announcement, where the two sides coordinated the public messaging around the decision. This is not speculation. Bloomberg reported it. The meeting happened. The coordination happened. The question is not whether Saudi Arabia and China are aligned on this. The question is how far and how fast this alignment moves. Received. That is announcement number 2. Announcement number 3, and this is the one that almost nobody in the mainstream financial press is addressing with appropriate seriousness. The mechanism of contagion. When Saudi Arabia signals a structural review of its dollar reserve architecture, it does not act in isolation. It provides political cover for every other sovereign wealth fund, central bank, and oil exporting nation that has been privately conducting the same review but lacked the institutional courage to move first. Saudi Arabia just moved first. In the Gulf, in OPEC, in the Global South, the question that every Treasury official is now asking is not whether to diversify away from the dollar. That question was settled months ago. The question is now one of timing, sequencing, and how to manage the transition without triggering the disorderly unraveling they are trying to avoid. The International Energy Agency estimated in its April 2026 report that approximately 61% of global oil transactions are still settled in US dollars. That figure, which was 79% in 2019, has declined by 18 percentage points in 7 years. The decline has accelerated. If the Saudi freeze catalyzes even a modest acceleration of that existing trend, if it moves the annual rate of dollar share decline from 2 percentage points to 4, the compounding effect over a decade is transformative. Not catastrophic in the immediate term. Transformative over a horizon of 5 to 10 years. And financial systems do not need to collapse suddenly to inflict serious damage. They inflict damage through the slow structural withdrawal of the conditions that made them function. If you carry a mortgage, a car payment, or any form of debt with a floating interest rate, you should understand this. Declining global dollar demand means the Federal Reserve has less ability to export inflation and more domestic pressure to raise rates to maintain currency credibility. The transmission mechanism from Riyadh to your monthly payment is not theoretical. It is a function of basic monetary architecture. Now let us talk about what the official response has been, because it is illuminating in its inadequacy. The U.S. Treasury issued a statement describing the Saudi freeze as a routine portfolio review consistent with normal sovereign wealth management practices. The Federal Reserve declined to comment. The White House characterized questions about the petrodollar as speculative. The mainstream financial press largely followed this framing, running headlines focused on the bilateral diplomatic relationship rather than the systemic financial implications. Think carefully about what this response pattern represents. When the world's largest oil exporter formally freezes $14 billion in US denominated assets and announces a policy review of its entire dollar reserve framework, and the response from Washington is to characterize it as routine, one of two things is true. Either the administration genuinely does not understand the significance of what just happened, or it understands perfectly and has concluded that public acknowledgement would accelerate the very dynamic it is hoping to contain. Both possibilities are deeply concerning for different reasons. The Wall Street Journal reported on Thursday that senior Treasury officials held an emergency coordination call with the Federal Reserve, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Office of Financial Research on Wednesday evening, the evening after the freeze was announced. Emergency coordination calls are not held in response to routine portfolio management decisions. They are held in response to systemic signals. The call happened, and yet the public posture remains. Nothing to see here. This pattern, emergency internal response combined with public minimization, is precisely the pattern we saw in the months before the 2008 financial crisis, when Federal Reserve officials were privately stress testing bank balance sheets while publicly assuring markets that subprime exposure was contained. The public assurance was not accurate then. There is no particular reason to believe the public minimization is accurate now. This pattern has a historical precedent, and it is worth examining carefully because history does not repeat, but it rhymes with remarkable precision. In the early 1970s, Richard Nixon faced a structurally similar crisis of dollar credibility. The Bretton Woods system, the post-war arrangement that fixed the dollar to gold at $35 per ounce and fixed all other currencies to the dollar, was under terminal strain. European central banks, led by France, had been quietly converting dollar reserves to gold for years, draining Fort Knox of its physical backing. Nixon's Treasury Secretary, John Connally, famously told European finance ministers that the dollar is our currency, but your problem. The administration minimized. It explained away. It characterized European gold conversions as routine. And then, on August 15, 1971, Nixon went on national television and announced that the United States was closing the gold window, unilaterally ending the dollar's convertibility to gold and collapsing the Bretton Woods system overnight. The parallel is not exact. The mechanisms differ. The timeline is slower. But the structural dynamic is identical, a reserve currency losing the conditions that made it the world's preferred store of value, an administration minimizing the signals of that loss, and a moment of public acknowledgement that arrives, as these moments always do, after the private decisions have already been made. Saudi Arabia is not France in 1971. Its freeze of $14 billion is not the gold window closing, but it is the signal. And signals in monetary history matter more than the individual transactions that carry them. So where does this leave us? Let me give you three clear paths because the honest analysis does not permit a comfortable middle ground. Path 1. The freeze is resolved diplomatically within the next 60 to 90 days. Washington makes concessions, possibly on secondary sanctions scope, possibly on arms sales timelines, possibly through back-channel assurances about the dollar clearing infrastructure, and Riyadh quietly unfreezes the assets. The crisis is managed, and the underlying trend toward dollar diversification continues, but at a pace slow enough that the system absorbs it without acute disruption. This is the outcome Washington is working toward. It is possible. The diplomatic relationship between Washington and Riyadh has survived severe stress before. Path 2. The diplomatic resolution fails or is delayed beyond 90 days, during which time 2 or 3 additional Gulf sovereign wealth funds announce similar reviews, the yuan settlement share of Saudi oil exports crosses 40%, and the IMF is forced to formally acknowledge in its next World Economic Outlook that structural dollar demand erosion is occurring faster than its baseline models projected. In this path, the dollar does not collapse. But the Federal Reserve loses a meaningful degree of its current flexibility, long-term U.S. Treasury yields rise to reflect reduced foreign demand, and the domestic political consequences of higher borrowing costs create feedback loops that are genuinely difficult to manage. Path 3, and I want to be direct that I consider this the least likely but not the least possible scenario. The freeze becomes the public inflection point that triggers a cascading series of coordinated GCC and BRICS-adjacent reserve rebalancing announcements, combined with an acceleration of the yuan oil settlement framework to cover more than 50% of Saudi exports by end of 2026. In this path, you are looking at dollar demand destruction on a scale that the Federal Reserve's existing toolkit was not designed to manage. This is not a prediction of global financial collapse. It is a prediction of a structural transition that would be enormously disruptive and would arrive faster than any institution currently responsible for managing it is prepared to acknowledge. I believe we are moving toward Path 2 with a meaningful tail risk of Path 3 if the diplomatic response proves inadequate. Watch the PIF's next quarterly disclosure. Watch the UN settlement percentage in the monthly China-Saudi trade data. Watch whether any other GCC member announces a similar review in the next 30 days. Those data points will tell you with far more honesty than any official statement which path we are on. Tell me in the comments what you think Washington's next move is. Do you think the administration has a credible offer that brings Riyadh back to the table, or has the underlying strategic calculus already shifted too far? Save this video. Come back and check these predictions in 90 days. We will keep tracking every development as it unfolds. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update.